This is episode 104 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, we continue with a busy time in New Mexico's public policy, not making, but the impacts of public policies that were done over the last legislative session are now taking effect, and they're having real impacts. Of course, this week we saw the announcement of what Michelle Lujan Grisham, what Tim Keller, what many in the establishment are calling a huge victory for New Mexico. I'm talking, of course, about the NBC Universal deal to bring a studio here to the Albuquerque area, to Martinez Town, just south of downtown area. And there's a lot to talk about this. I've been talking about it on local media, whether it's television or the radio stations. And boy, before I give you a few of my 2 cents, what do you think about this whole situation, Wally?
Well, without a doubt, I've said it many times, if you pay 25 or 30% of somebody's operating expenses to come to your city, they will probably, or state, they will probably come to your city and state. And we have seen that happen in spades, and people are stretching their activities to get the higher level, the 30 instead of the 25, and getting more economic development add-ons as it is. The interesting thing is that voices across the state are starting to whisper. I won't name names, but I've seen some people that are normally quite progressive in their thinking and in their writing have even started to say, at what level does this thing become a problem? Is it 500 million, 600, 700, 800 million? And you've been raising these issues all along. And then what will be the benefit on a net basis to the economy? Huge questions. And we are going to get to see that experiment play out in real time and with real big money.
Yeah, and there's so many different points to make. Of course, we have criticized the film subsidy program ad nauseum. 25 cents on the dollar for this particular project will be returned to NBC Universal. Of course, you don't hear many progressives talking publicly. Maybe they are starting to wake up, but this is a very significant subsidy to a very successful, wealthy corporation. Again, it frustrates me. It's just a challenge for the Rio Grande Foundation that the left that normally opposes corporate welfare, you hear crickets on this issue. And that goes for elected officials too, who would be going apoplectic if you did anything like this for OG, oil and gas, or PNM, or some other company, whether it's located in New Mexico now or would be located in New Mexico after this kind of thing is done. Another major red flag, aside from the subsidies, which I'm not going to go into the numbers and whatnot about the film subsidies, it is uncapped. That's why you're seeing this kind of development in New Mexico, because of the law SB 2 passed in 2019. When you invest or you're given a studio, you are now able to take an unlimited amount of money. The $50 million cap, of course, is eliminated by the legislation. It's now $110 million, but you're totally skirting that whole thing and can tap into unlimited amounts of taxpayer dollars by having a facility like this in New Mexico. So who knows how much this could ultimately cost the citizens of our state. And finally, as if all of that isn't bad enough, the film subsidies, et cetera, you're pouring LEDA money into this whole mix. The city has approved their component. I have no doubt that the state, whether they have to approve anything or not, it'll be greased lightning going through $10.7 million of LIDA money. Again, these are checks written to corporations. This is prototypical corporate welfare of the kind that the Rio Grande Foundation most opposes. LIDA is not quite as high on the list as film subsidies because they are a one-time expenditure, although in this case, we're dealing with $10.7 million handed to NBC Universal for annual lease payments of $1.17 million. Do the math, and you get over 9 years of lease payments paid for by the taxpayers. So NBC Universal is getting essentially a free studio out of the deal, and then 25 cents on the dollar back from the taxpayer for the privilege of filming here. It's just unbelievable. And the last thing I'll say on this before, again, I give you some final thoughts, is we are literally taking money from the oil and gas surplus. Again, there's supposed to be another $1 billion available next year for the legislature to spend. So we're taking that $1 billion surplus, and rather than doing some kind of reform, tax cuts, reform the gross receipts, doing something to make New Mexico as a whole more attractive, and the $1 billion is the kind of money that you could easily do that with, and do it on a permanent basis. Even Amazon.com, and giving them generous kind of tax exemptions or something. We are tying our economy to a very fleeting, very mobile, very obviously rapacious industry that can come and go at any time. So, Wally.
Well, my final thought is that when you talk corporate welfare, a lot of times the left is very fond of pointing out corporate welfare, like in the oil and gas industry, where they can deduct certain costs more quickly, as opposed to having to capitalize them and amortize them over time. That sort of corporate welfare is much more of a timing thing. This is, we are writing a check and handing it to people. It is corporate welfare on steroids, and hopefully they stick around because, as you say, as subsidies have coming on in states across our fair nation, the industry has followed wherever the next set of deep pockets is. And it's a little bit like we've won the lottery here in New Mexico, and our poor relatives out in Hollywood are now coming to help us spend our riches here in New Mexico.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, hopefully they don't stay. I think the question is, this is more like, we are a young person, say in grade school or middle school, who doesn't have many friends, and we are paying friends right now to come and hang out with us, and that is the film industry. They're very cool. They're very progressive. They're very into all the latest hip trends, but we are paying them nonetheless. And as long as we have that money sloshing around, the oil and gas money is growing and doing well, then we'll have the money to pay these friends. But the moment that we don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to throw at Hollywood filmmakers, they will pick up and go somewhere else. And I think that is a big part. That's one of the many reasons why this is so problematic. And speaking of the moral virtues of these friends, again, abortion is not the Rio Grande Foundation's issue, but this is one of those issues that, with regard to Hollywood and the film industry, suddenly there's been a convergence of issues with regard to abortion and the filmmaking industry that I think shows how cultural conservative, religious conservatives, and free market conservatives in the real world generally need to stick together, especially in a state like New Mexico. That may not be what may be true for New Mexico, may not necessarily be true for Alabama, but just the last few days, Alyssa Milano, who is one of the most radical and vocal left-wing folks out of Hollywood, she helped create a comprehensive state-by-state abortion bill guide for filmmakers, because we all know about Georgia and the threats that certain companies, Disney and Netflix, have made to leave Georgia based on their abortion law. Well, you can go to variety.com, and we'll put this in the show notes on the website. You can find this article with a helpful map showing if a state is among the most threatened, under threat, or least threatened by for abortion rights. And New Mexico, as we all know, is among the most liberal, progressive, most actively pro-choice states in the entire country. And if there's anything good that can come out of this, it is worth remembering that Michigan killed their film subsidies in part because Michael Moore was taking money from his home state, Michigan, and Republicans who ran the show up there got sick of Michael Moore trashing them and everything that Republicans stood for, and they decided to pull out of the subsidy game. New Mexico is a progressive state. It's not going to change its policies, but other states, Georgia, Louisiana, these conservative states, I think that maybe they will see the light and their politicians will say, look, these Hollywood people do not reflect our values. We are going to go the other direction. We're a long way from that in New Mexico. There are some traditional Democrats. There are people who I think could be maybe turned in a better direction because of the antics of people like Alyssa Milano. But, we're going to be working slowly and surely to educate wide variety of people from all different walks of life on the negatives of film subsidies. Wally?
Well, as I read the Variety article, the thing that also struck me is they're developing an app that would, quote, guarantee we can spend money in places that will not fund voter suppression, inequality, and the stripping away of anyone's rights. Now, I could be wrong, but I would guess that would mean that they are going to support right to work. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I can see it now, yes.
Okay, and in case you cannot see our faces on this podcasting, you can't. Sarcasm meter went off. And so it's interesting. They say things like that, but it's like, really, what rights are we talking? What they're really talking about is using a tool, like they said, Minivan, which is the progressive canvassing thing. So, this is the 1984, the book 1984 applied to modern day times. And I do think that there will be some pushback from initiatives like this, and we will have to wait and see what that means here in New Mexico.
No doubt about it. And as if all of this talk of incentives and corporate welfare isn't enough, I found a article, very recent article from Governing Magazine. This is kind of the journal of the governing class, people who work in government, maybe state legislators. So definitely not a conservative or free market inherently publication. But they there's research out there, brand new research. It's not even really published yet, but they cited some early documents from these researchers that found that, quote, investment tax credits, property tax abatements, and tax credits for research and development were linked with worse overall fiscal health for the jurisdiction that enacted them. This is from a study. You can find details there at errorsofenchantment.com. And I'll give you one guess as to which state relies most heavily on tax incentives. And this is as a percentage of the value added of each of the state's industries. So it's not just like California because they have the biggest economy. So it's really a percentage of the economy. There's a state.
I'm afraid it's not Mississippi or Alabama. Am I correct?
Oh, you're right. A state that often named in that company, however.
Is it New Mexico?
It is. It is New Mexico.
That's too bad.
So between 2013 and 2015. So not a long window, but this is, again, what the information is that we were given in this report. As a percentage, New Mexico's at 4.5% of the value added. And again, that's for even people like myself who study this stuff on a pretty regular basis. I had to be hard pressed to get an understanding of exactly what 4.5% of the value added means. But to give you an idea of where we're coming in, that's number one of all the states studied. Iowa's number 2 at 3.8%, and the state after that is New York at 3.7%. So we're number one with the bullet, folks. Not a surprise there. The gross receipts tax is a part of that equation because you really have to get some incentives from the state to avoid the gross receipts tax as a major business enterprise to even want to come here. I'm sure the film subsidies are a big part of this, and it's just very interesting, damning material, because the researchers are saying this race to the bottom, this offering subsidies and incentives to individual companies and industries is not a road to economic success. And I think New Mexico really arguably is the poster child for that.
Yes, and what these incentives do in places like New Mexico is because we have a few very uncompetitive tax policies and regulatory policies is New Mexico and other states like us have to overcome those to get business in their state. Whereas the states that do very well have just solid policies, so they don't have to do these incentives. And I kind of liken it to I'm overweight and I have high blood pressure, so I'm going to take blood pressure medicine and Crestor as opposed to diet and exercise, which would be the good way to do it. Have a solid tax policy, and lest there be any doubt, New Mexico's gross receipts tax, taxing services, having layering of taxation of services is a very damaging economic policy that we seem to have a hard time weaning ourselves and bringing some rationality to that. And as you alluded to earlier in the show, if we have another $1 billion, that could now be the time to do some adjustment to the gross receipts tax with that $1 billion? Or are we going to allocate that 3 times over and have nothing there to look at changing that gross receipts tax policy for a better chance at long-term economic success in our state?
You got it, Wally. Well, as if
that was a rhetorical question.
I hear you. I hear you. Well, as if to kind of just continue this whole conversation about bad New Mexico policies and where we're not getting things right. An organization that Rio Grande Foundation very rarely sees eye to eye with, Voices for Children. They are kind of a competing think tank, very left-wing, based here in New Mexico. They do what I think is a pretty darn good report. They actually don't do it themselves. The Annie E. Casey Foundation really is the progenitor of this particular report. Voices for Children helps distribute it. And as such, it doesn't have a lot of the Voices for Children main policy goals inherent in it. It actually has real policy that impact children in a negative context. And the results just came out in the latest report for 2019. We're overall number 50, which is not a surprise. We've been very low for many years in this report, whether it was Bill Richardson as governor, Susana Martinez as governor, or for the vast majority of the time, which Democrats have controlled both houses of the legislature, and nobody really talks about. But you can go to aecf.org and find the recent kids count report. And I just want to go through a few of the factors that they look at. And for those of you who know what Voices for Children works on, they certainly are very silent about film subsidies and the lack of accountability there, and the fact that they are very regressive or give money to the wealthy, but they never talk about those kinds of things. And here's what the report says. 49th on economic well-being. This is for children. Children in poverty is one component of that. Children whose parents lack secure employment. Children living in households with a high housing cost burden. So housing is a disproportionate burden on the family financially. Teens not in school and not working. Now, Voices for Children pretty much takes up the mantle of left-wing policies on all areas, and they don't have real solutions to any of these goals. Their solutions are all about big government, and pre-K, that's their solution. Anyway, education, we're 50th. We're 49th in that previous category. young children not in school. Well, okay, that's their pre-K right there. I'm not sure that ages 3 and 4-year-olds, this is one component of this report I don't think is really valuable, because you're just measuring if they're in school or not, and that's a policy goal of folks like Voices for Children. 4th graders not proficient in reading. Okay, that's an important one. We've worked on that. 8th graders not proficient in math. High school students not graduating on time. What do they talk about with regard to the public schools? Just more money, not a lot more accountability, not much more focus on key aspects like 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. Health, low birth weight babies, children without health insurance, child and teen deaths per 100,000, teens who abuse alcohol or drugs. We're 48th in that. And family and community, single parent families. You will never hear Voices for Children talk about, we just passed Father's Day. They will never make a mention of the importance of fathers in the household. Children and families where the head of household lacks a high school diploma. Children living in high poverty areas and teen births per 1,000. New Mexico is 50th in that particular report. So it all adds up to New Mexico in 50th. It's a reasonably good report. I think the one category that just doesn't make sense is young children not in school. I'm not sure how. I think the research is very questionable in terms of 3 and 4-year-olds being in school. You could go to Finland and Sweden and all the countries that the left loves, and the schooling year doesn't even begin until, I think in Finland, it's 6 years old. So the idea that we should be sticking 3 and 4-year-olds in school is suspicious, but the rest of this is fairly reasonable, and it's basically poverty. We have a poverty state, and Voices for Children wants to perpetuate poverty while saying that their policies will not do that, or they'll impact positively the poverty issue. So, Wally, any of your thoughts on this particular report?
Well, and I was with you. That 3 and 4 year ages 3 and 4 not in school, that raised an eyebrow with me. The fact that 15 others basically pass the common sense point of view in terms of not saying that I have a detailed econometric analysis that it ties back to well-being, but these are all things. This report is very, very interesting. And as we look at policies, particularly in education, proficiency in reading and math, graduation on time, and where New Mexico's struggled, those are the ones that it seems like Voices for Children, if they could be a little more policy oriented and a little more of, we have a problem, let's tax more and keep inefficiency in government, that's somebody else's problem. Maybe we could do a little better on some of these items.
Yeah, if anyone from Voices for Children is listening, if you actually want to help solve some of these issues and work in a bipartisan nature to solve a vast majority of these variables, I think there's a lot of common ground there with the Rio Grande Foundation and other organizations. We are eager to work on 4th grade reading, math results, high school graduation, parents with high school diplomas. There are a variety of things that we want to work on, and alleviating poverty really is the ultimate goal of the Rio Grande Foundation. We just believe that free markets and limited government are the best vehicles for that, not new government programs. New Mexico is the poster child for government programs not working, because every time we see a new government program, New Mexico is the first on board, the most eligible, willing to engage. And what results do we have? I mean, the latest, I think the biggest would be Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. What real results have we seen? Have we seen overall improvement across the board? New Mexico certainly doesn't seem to have. In fact, you see decline or worsening results. Just look at healthcare. And this is one of the nice things about the report. In the United States, it's 8.3%. New Mexico, they go back to 2010, 8.7%. So
that's low birth weight babies, a hugely important factor in long-term.
So we've gone up to 9.5%. That's basically since Obamacare took effect. So it's questionable what some of these impacts really are in terms of Obamacare and its impact on actual healthcare outcomes. So anyway, I'm not holding my breath, Wally, but rather than just expand government all the time, every single way possible, it would be great if they took a look at their own information and actually did something positive with it. So an issue that would create some jobs and some economic prosperity for our state that has a lot more wrinkles to it than I think we previously discussed, Wally, is this Holtec facility in southeastern New Mexico. And one of the players at hand, the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, seems to have a little problem with communication. Now, these fancy trade associations, and I know you've had a history of working in some trade associations, these are the guys that came out and opposed the siting of this holding facility, the storage facility for spent nuclear fuel down in the Carlsbad Hobbs area. And there was an article in one news outlet that was citing, the Permian Basin Petroleum Association has no position on Holtec. And then a separate article in the Hobbs newspaper said, quotes the head of that organization as saying, "The concern we have, the placement of this facility housing high-level radioactive waste puts at risk the most important energy-producing basin in North America." So which is it? Is it we have no position, or this is a dagger at the heart of the oil industry, which supports so much of New Mexico's economy? And Wally, I'm not expecting you to have all the answers, but maybe some insights into how this particular organization maybe is engaging here, why they seem so at cross purposes with themselves.
Well, and there is sometimes when these things come up, and certainly it does in formal rulemaking and in processes, there are issues that are raised by all parties. So I will say, and not in any way defending PBPA, but giving them the benefit of the doubt, it's very possible they say, hey, we have these concerns, and if these can be taken care of, life is good for us. But by merely expressing a concern, it might be, and it's possible in this case, that somebody took that and said, that concern is way beyond a concern. They're against it. They say these things can't be taken care of. This project needs to go away. And one thing that the head of the organization, Ben Shepard, did say was that they're for all forms of energy. And that's a good policy, because it doesn't seem like those that oppose energy, they're not very limited in what they are not opposed to. They seem to like wind, they seem to like solar, and everything else is horrible. And if we are going to run our economy on wind and solar for the foreseeable future, we are going to be one poor and backward stone-aged civilization here in the United States.
Yeah, we're going to be following up on this issue with discussions. John Heaton, one of the local economic development folks involved with the Holtec facility in the Carlsbad area, Karen Cowan. These folks are going to get full-length interviews. We're going to talk at some length with both of them about the Holtec issue. These will be interview podcasts released in the weeks ahead, so stay tuned, and we're going to find out more from some of these folks about this issue, because this is not just a facility with jobs and economic prosperity in southeast New Mexico. It is a real opportunity to start moving forward again on what everybody acknowledges is a clean, carbon-free form of electricity generation that also has roots in New Mexico on uranium production side of things. And if we can get nuclear, carbon-free nuclear going again, that could be jobs and economic prosperity for parts of western New Mexico, specifically Grants and McKinley County and some of these areas that really are economic basket cases. So we'll see what happens. But Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor, came out swinging against this facility. Now, it seems to me that it must have been a position that was very easy for her to adopt, because the evidence and the level of opposition from the cattle growers of New Mexico and this petroleum organization out of Midland, Texas, it seems like they don't quite have their arguments together in a clear, coherent argument against this development in southeast New Mexico. It seems very hard to pin them down exactly why they're concerned and what that harm is going to be on their industries. But we will be talking to some of these folks and see where that conversation goes. We have ART, Wally, the
gift that just keeps on giving and
Yes.
giving and giving.
Yes.
Talk about giving till it hurts. It's starting to hurt.
Well, we do have the new buses. At least they were announced this week, and they have some sky blue pattern. They're lovely. Sure, they're going to look great someday going down those New Mexico streets, Central Avenue. But our friends at KOAT TV did a excellent report in which they discovered that the city has paid $300,000 over the past year just to maintain these empty bus stops. They indicate that includes picking up garbage, power washing, electricity for these unused monitors and unused other aspects of these bus stops. And I just don't know when the hits are going to stop coming with the ART. Supposedly, now the Keller administration is saying by the end of this year, so end of 2019, maybe beginning of 2020, we could see those lovely buses rolling down Central Avenue. But $300,000 to maintain this bus. Again, we just raised taxes, Wally. What gives?
Well, this whole art project, the more you dig into it, the more it just makes me shake my head. You know, we had the electric buses, and then we sent those back to whence they came. The new buses cost $856,000 and some change and hold 42 people. You know, if you look at capital costs, meaning, okay, economists, at least back when I was an economics student, we always like to talk about alternatives and the cost of alternatives. That's over $20,000 of capital cost for every seat in that bus. And that assumes that every seat is taken. You know, we have articulated buses right now in Albuquerque that when you see those things drive, they're huge. They probably hold, if not identically 42 close to it, and they're running virtually empty. So this thing is cost, and hopefully we know that there will not be a direct return. You know, they will not recover the cost that they put in the project. We're just looking for some positive as opposed to just wasting 100% of the money that's gone into the project. And we're not there yet. We'll have to see if that happens. One of these days, like you say, there may be a bus running up and down Central, these beautiful sky blue buses, and hopefully somebody will ride in them. And the people that have invested and have businesses along Central will see some benefit to this huge project.
Yeah, and bus passengers, the number of bus passengers in the city of Albuquerque has been declining precipitously in recent years. Obviously, a lot of that can be laid at the feet of ride sharing like Lyft and Uber, but I live off of Coors. I'm out in the evenings and afternoons, and you see these big, heavy buses, often the articulated types, going up and down Coors Boulevard, one of the city's major thoroughfares, and you have 1 to 2, maybe 3 people on the bus at any given time. This is not environmentally friendly transportation. That is one of the myths. And again, it gets back to why can't folks on the left, environmental groups, etc., judge the world and realize that the world works differently from their grand schemes and plans. It's actually very complicated to reduce carbon emissions and do so in a way, it's not just about the buses being empty. It's about what could be done with $300,000, what could be done with $130 million to actually improve the environment of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, our nation as a whole, and ultimately globally, even $300,000 isn't going to make a huge difference for the environment, but just wasting it on a bus system that's not even in use right now, and it's probably not going to do much for the environment and carbon dioxide emissions, it strikes me as just bizarre. And again, you don't hear the Sierra Club, you don't hear the conservation voters of New Mexico, you don't hear these so-called environmental groups taking up the mantle of, we need a transit system that actually operates and reduces carbon emissions, for example. Instead, you just get this blind, let's do it, let's spend the money. It's almost as if they value big government more than they value the environment, Wally. Could that be the truth?
One would just pray that it were not the truth, but this fascination and love of mass transit, even when it makes absolutely positively no sense, is just it's a huge New Mexico problem. And then lest there be any doubt that buses aren't the only problem, we have a little train problem that in not too long ago podcast talked about how horrible that thing was, and the fact that we could take the sums of money we're talking about here and buy riders, vehicles to use themselves that we know would use less resources and produce less carbon dioxide for the very reason you said. A 42-passenger bus with 2 people on it is so far inferior to a efficient small vehicle with 1 or 2 people riding in it. But I don't know. That's one of those things. Does it have a religious overtone where that is like the good ombudsman of the cause? Is that we can see this. We can see this public transit, and it makes sense. Nobody likes it. Few people use it. It costs lots of money, but must be making somebody feel good.
My favorite, The Onion story of all time, probably, even though the Babylon Bee has been an amazing satirical news source in recent years, but one of the greatest of all time, way back in the year 2000, The Onion report 98% of U.S. commuters favor public transportation for others. And that pretty much encapsulates it. Sometimes satirical news is better than the real thing. Folks, we're going to leave it there in just a minute. KrisAnne Hall, attorney, former prosecutor, constitutional scholar, highlighting the 10th Amendment and state sovereignty, U.S. Constitution, of course. She's a firebrand. She's a great speaker. That event is a luncheon at the Marriott Pyramid, located there at I-25 and Paseo del Norte, Wednesday, July 10th, 2019, noon to 1 p.m. Tickets are available, lunch provided, $30 currently. That price rises up to $40 right around the 4th of July holiday. Please make it, be a part of this exciting event, and hear what KrisAnne Hall has to say. It will be well worth it, I assure you. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.